The summer sun was just beginning to set over Willowbrook Estates when David Martinez heard the sharp crack of electricity and felt his body convulse against the perfectly manicured grass. His 7-year-old daughter Emma's birthday party had been going beautifully just moments before. Now, as the taser's effects wore off and his vision cleared, he could see her small face pressed against the living room window, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Stay down," Officer Jake Thompson barked, his hand still gripping the yellow taser. Behind him stood Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk playing across her lips. "I warned you, Martinez. Nobody ignores HOA regulations in my neighborhood." David's wife Maria rushed out from behind the inflatable bounce house they'd rented for Emma's party, her face a mixture of terror and rage. "What is wrong with you people? It's our daughter's birthday." The whole mess had started 3 weeks earlier when David received a violation notice for their fence height. According to Karen, their 6-foot privacy fence violated the community's aesthetic standards by being 2 inches too tall. David had measured himself. It was exactly -1 feet, the maximum allowed in their HOA agreement, but Karen insisted her measurements were correct. Mrs. Whitmore called in a complaint about an unpermitted structure. Officer Thompson explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who clearly believed he was in the right. "She says you've been ignoring official HOA notices for weeks." David slowly pushed himself up to his elbows, still feeling the after effects of the electrical shock. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was being tased on his own property, in front of his family and friends, over 2 inches of fence. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. I have documentation that proves." "Documentation?" Karen laughed, stepping forward with a manila folder clutched in her manicured hands. "David, honey, you've been in violation since day one. This fence exceeds community standards, and your refusal to comply has forced us to take legal action." Emma's friends' parents began gathering their children, whispering among themselves as they witnessed the surreal scene unfolding on the Martinez family's front lawn. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration had turned into a neighborhood spectacle that would be talked about for years. Officer Thompson was relatively new to the force and took HOA calls seriously. In his mind, property violations were gateway crimes that led to neighborhood decay. He'd seen it before in other communities. Let one violation slide, and soon you'd have broken windows, overgrown yards, and plummeting property values. "I'm going to need you to stand up slowly and to keep your hands visible," Thompson instructed, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. "Mrs. Whitmore has a court order here that gives the HOA authority to remove the structure." Immediately, Maria knelt beside her husband, helping him to his feet. "This is insane. David, tell them about the survey. Tell them about what we found." David caught his wife's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not yet. He had learned, over his 15 years as a civil rights attorney, that timing was everything. Sometimes you had to let your opponents dig themselves deeper before revealing your hand. Karen waved the papers triumphantly. "The court order is very clear. The fence comes down today, or you'll be held in contempt. Officer Thompson here is authorized to arrest you if you continue to interfere." Neighbors had begun emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on her porch, phone in hand, clearly recording the incident. The Johnsons from across the street watched from their driveway, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Karen," David said quietly, brushing grass stains off his shirt, "before Officer Thompson here makes a decision he might regret. Don't you think you should actually read that court order?" Something in David's tone made Thompson pause. There was no fear in the man's voice, no desperate pleading. Instead, there was something that sounded almost like confidence. Karen's grip tightened on the folder. "I know exactly what it says, David." The judge ruled in favor of the HOA. "The fence is coming down." David reached slowly into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Officer Thompson's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but David simply pulled out a folded document of his own. "Officer Thompson," David said calmly, "before you arrest me in front of my daughter on her birthday, I think there's something you should know about Mrs. Whitmore's court order." The confidence in David's voice made everyone freeze. Karen's smirk faltered slightly, and Officer Thompson found himself genuinely curious about what the man was holding. What could David possibly know that would change everything? The answer would shake the very foundation of Willowbrook Estates. Officer Thompson studied David's face, noting the complete absence of fear in a man who had just been tased in front of his family. Something didn't add up in his 3 years on the force. He'd seen plenty of guilty people, and they all had the same look when cornered desperation mixed with defiance. David Martinez looked like a man holding phrases. "What document?" Thompson asked, his hand still hovering near his handcuffs, but his voice less certain than before. Karen stepped between them quickly. "Officer, don't let him distract you with more of his legal mumbo-jumbo. We have a valid court order, and this man is in violation, period." But David had already begun unfolding his papers, and Maria moved closer to her husband, her earlier fear replaced by something that looked almost like anticipation. She knew that look on David's face. It was the same expression he wore in the courtroom when he was about to deliver a devastating cross-examination. "Mrs. Whitmore," David said, his voice carrying across the lawn to where neighbors continued gathering. "When exactly did you say you filed this court order?" Karen's eyes narrowed. 2 weeks ago, just like I told you in the violation notice. Judge Patterson ruled that your fence violates community standards and must be removed immediately." David nodded thoughtfully. "Judge Patterson? That's interesting." He looked directly at Officer Thompson. "Officer, I'm sure you're familiar with proper legal procedures. Before you arrest someone based on a court order, don't you typically verify its authenticity?" Thompson felt a prickle of unease. He'd been so focused on supporting the HOA property values were important. After all, that he hadn't actually examined the paperwork closely. Karen had called, explained the situation, showed him official-looking documents, and he'd responded accordingly. "The order looks legitimate," Thompson said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Looks legitimate," David repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words." He held up his own document. "This is a copy of Judge Patterson's actual docket from 2 weeks ago. Would you like to know what cases he was hearing that day?" Karen's face had gone pale, but she pushed forward aggressively. "David, you're stalling." Officer Thompson, this man is trying to manipulate you with divorce proceedings between Henderson and Henderson. David continued, reading from his paper. A custody dispute involving the Williams family, a drunk driving case. But you know, what's not on here? Officer Thompson, any HOA dispute involving the Martinez family or Willowbrook estates. The gathered neighbors began murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Chen stepped closer, her phone still recording, clearly sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Officer Thompson looked between David and Karen, confusion evident on his face. Mrs. Whitmore, can you explain this discrepancy? Karen's composure was cracking, but she doubled down. There must be some mistake in their records. Court systems make errors all the time. The important thing is that we have a valid order right here. She waved the manila folder. David's fence is still in violation, regardless of any paperwork confusion. David smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Paperwork confusion. That's one way to put it. He turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors, you know? It's funny how these HOA disputes work. Most people just pay the fines and comply with the orders because they assume the HOA knows what they're talking about. They trust that the people in charge are acting in good faith. Maria stepped forward, her earlier fear completely replaced by righteous anger. Tell them about the other violations. David, tell them what we discovered. Karen's eyes darted nervously between the couple. I don't know what lies you're planning to spread. But, not lies. Karen, facts. David pulled out another document. Officer Thompson, in the past 6 months, how many HOA violation calls have you responded to in Willowbrook Estates? Thompson thought for a moment. Quite a few, maybe 15 or 20. Mrs. Whitmore runs a tight ship. She keeps the neighborhood standards high. 15 or 20, David nodded. And in every case, you found that the homeowner was indeed in violation and needed to pay fines or make corrections, right? That's right. Property values don't maintain themselves. David looked around at his neighbors, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The Johnsons had been fined for their mailbox design. The Patels had been cited for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Mrs. Chen had been forced to repaint her shutters because the blue was allegedly too bright. What if I told you, David said quietly, that not a single one of those violations was legitimate? What if I told you that every measurement Karen provided was falsified, every regulation she cited was either misquoted or completely fabricated? The crowd fell silent. Officer Thompson felt his stomach drop. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Martinez. It's about to become a more serious problem, David replied. Because what Karen doesn't know is that I've spent the last 3 weeks doing something she never expected. Karen tried to interrupt. David, whatever conspiracy theory you're cooking up, I hired a professional surveyor, David continued, his voice cutting through her protests. I also hired a private investigator to look into the HOA's recent activities, and most importantly, I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office about fraudulent legal documents being used to extort homeowners. Officer Thompson's hand dropped away from his handcuffs entirely. Fraudulent legal documents. David held up the paper Karen had been waving around. This court order is fake. Officer Thompson, the letterhead is wrong. The case number doesn't exist in the system. And Judge Patterson's signature is a poor forgery. Karen has been using fabricated legal documents to intimidate homeowners into compliance. The implications hit Thompson like a freight train. If David was telling the truth, then he had just tased an innocent man based on falsified evidence. His career could be over. But Karen wasn't finished fighting. You can't prove any of that, she screamed, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. These people will believe anything to avoid taking responsibility for their violations. David looked at his wife, and Maria nodded. It was time. Actually, Karen, I can prove it. Because 20 minutes ago, while you were busy calling Officer Thompson to come arrest me, the state investigator you've been trying to avoid finally caught up with you. Karen's face went white as David pointed toward the street, where an unmarked sedan had just pulled up to the curb. The real question was, what else had Karen been hiding? The answer would destroy everything she'd built. Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of the unmarked sedan, her badge already visible on her belt. She wasn't just any investigator, she was Mrs. Chen's daughter, a financial crimes specialist with the State Attorney General's office, and she'd been building a case against Karen Whitmore for the past month. Good evening, everyone, Detective Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough white-collar crime to fill several prisons. Mrs. Whitmore, we've been trying to reach you. Karen's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, pure panic. I don't know what this is about. I was just handling a routine HOA matter. Officer Thompson looked between the detective and David. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed starting to fall into place. Detective Chen, can you explain what's going on here? Detective Chen opened her folder, pulling out a thick stack of documents. Mr. Martinez contacted our office 3 weeks ago with concerns about fraudulent court orders being used to extort money from homeowners. What we discovered during our investigation was far more extensive than simple document forgery. David's neighbors pressed closer, sensing that they were about to learn something that would change everything they thought they knew about their community. Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Chang continued, you've been operating an elaborate fraud scheme for over 2 years. The court orders were just the beginning. Karen tried to back away, but Officer Thompson moved to block her path. His earlier certainty about the situation completely evaporated. Mom, I think you should stay and hear this. Detective Chen flipped through her papers. Let's start with the violations themselves. Mrs. Whitmore has been deliberately mismeasuring properties, using a ruler that's been modified to show incorrect lengths. The Johnson's mailbox that was supposedly 6 inches too far from the street. It's exactly where it should be. The Patel's flowers that weren't on the approved list. They're actually the exact varieties recommended in the original HOA guidelines. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the crowd. I told my daughter something was wrong when Karen claimed my shutters were too bright. I bought them specifically because they match the color samples in the HOA handbook. That's because they do match, Detective Chen confirmed. Mrs. Whitmore has been using an older color chart, But the violations were never the real crime, they were just the delivery method. David watched Karen's face carefully. Even now, cornered by law enforcement, she was calculating, looking for an escape route. But David knew there wasn't one. He'd made sure of that. The real crime, Detective Chen continued, was the money. Mrs. Whitmore has collected over $47,000 in fake fines and fees over the past 2 years. Money that should have gone to legitimate community improvements has been diverted to a personal account. The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. $47,000 meant every household in Willowbrook Estates had been scammed multiple times. Officer Thompson felt sick to his stomach. Mrs. Whitmore, is this true? Karen's mask finally slipped completely. You people have no idea how much work it takes to maintain a community like this. Do you think HOA presidents work for free? Do you think keeping property values high is easy? So you admit to the fraud? Detective Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. I admit to nothing, Karen snapped. These people are lazy homeowners who don't want to follow rules. And this is all some elaborate scheme to avoid their responsibilities. David stepped forward, pulling out yet another document. Actually, Karen, there's something else you should know about my investigation. Detective Chen nodded to David. Mr. Martinez has been cooperating with our office. He's also an attorney specializing in civil rights cases, which is why he knew exactly how to document your activities. Karen's eyes widened as the final piece clicked into place. You're a lawyer? 15 years? David confirmed. I specialize in cases involving abuse of authority and fraudulent business practices. You've been targeting the wrong neighborhood. Karen, Officer Thompson ran his hand through his hair, the magnitude of his mistake becoming clear. Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I should have verified the documents before taking any action. Actually, Officer Thompson, your response was understandable. David said diplomatically, Karen is very good at what she does. She's been perfecting this system for years. Probably in other communities before this one. Detective Chen nodded. We're investigating her previous HOA positions in 3 other states. The pattern is consistent. She moves into a community, gets elected to the HOA board, then systematically begins extracting money through fake violations and fraudulent legal threats. Karen made one last desperate attempt. You can't prove I kept any money. Every fine collected went through proper channels. David smiled grimly. Actually, Karen, that's where you made your biggest mistake. He looked at Detective Chen, who nodded for him to continue. When you had my fence measured by your certified inspector, you charged me $300 for the service. But that inspector doesn't exist, does he? The check was deposited into your personal account. Karen's face went white. How could you possibly know that? Because I'm not just any lawyer, Karen. I'm a forensic accountant's husband. David gestured to Maria, who stepped forward with her own folder. Maria Martinez, CPA. She introduced herself to Detective Chen. I've been tracking every financial transaction related to HOA activities in Willowbrook Estates for the past month. Karen's been very sloppy with her money laundering. The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word as the full scope of Karen's deception became clear. Detective Chen reached for her handcuffs. Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, forgery, and theft. You have the right to remain silent." But as the detective began reading Miranda rights, Karen looked directly at David with pure hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started. There are things about this community that you don't understand. Things that are going to make your family very uncomfortable living here." David's blood ran cold. What else was Karen hiding? And what kind of revenge was she planning from behind bars? The nightmare wasn't over, it was just beginning. 3 months later, David Martinez stood in his backyard, watching Emma play on the swing set they'd installed right next to their perfectly legal 6-foot fence. The early autumn air was crisp, and the sound of his daughter's laughter was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. Officer Thompson appeared at the gate, but this time he was smiling and carrying a small wrapped present. "Hope I'm not intruding," he called out. "I brought Emma a belated birthday gift." David walked over to meet him, extending his hand. "Jake, you're always welcome here. How did the testimony go today?" Thompson shook his head in amazement. "Karen got 5 years in federal prison. The judge called it one of the most systematic and callous fraud schemes he'd ever seen. She won't be bothering any HOA communities for a long time." Emma ran over, curious about the visitor who used to be scary, but now brought presents. "Is that for me?" "It sure is," Thompson said, kneeling to her level. "It's a book about a little girl who becomes a detective. I thought you might like it since you helped catch a bad guy just by being brave." Emma beamed and ran to show her mother, who was tending to a garden full of flowers that were definitely not on any approved list because there was no approved list. The new HOA board had discovered that most of Karen's rules had been completely fabricated. The other homeowners are getting their money back, Thompson continued. 47,000 plus interest. Turns out Karen had been running this scam in 4 different states. The FBI estimates she stole over $200,000 total. David nodded, satisfied, but not surprised. What about her threat? The thing she said about making our family uncomfortable. Thompson laughed. That was her last desperate bluff. Turns out she was referring to a fake HOA rule about troublemaker families that she planned to use to harass you. She had actually prepared fake violation notices for things like excessive children's laughter and unauthorized birthday celebrations. The woman was completely unhinged. Maria joined them, wiping her hands on a gardening towel. The new HOA president stopped by yesterday. She told David. Mrs. Johnson apologized again for not speaking up sooner. She said she knew something was wrong, but was afraid to challenge Karen. A lot of people were afraid, David acknowledged. That's how people like Karen operate. They rely on intimidation and the assumption that most people won't fight back. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. I learned something important from this whole situation. I got so focused on supporting authority that I forgot to question whether that authority was legitimate. I won't make that mistake again. Detective Chen's car pulled up to the curb, and she got out carrying a large envelope. As she approached, David could see she was smiling. Good news, she announced. The federal prosecutor wants to use Karen's case as a model for training other investigators. What you did documenting everything, staying calm, building an airtight case that's going to help protect other communities from similar scams, Emma came running back, clutching her new book. "Mommy, can we have another birthday party? One where nobody gets hurt?" The adults all left, and David scooped up his daughter. "Sweetheart, every day is a celebration when your family is safe and you're surrounded by good neighbors." Mrs. Chen approached from next door, carrying a plate of cookies. "I wanted to thank you again, David. My daughter says the investigation found that Karen had been planning to target our family next. Something about our garden being ethnically inappropriate." "Ethnically inappropriate?" Maria asked, incredulous. She was going to claim the vegetables that weren't traditionally American violated community standards. Detective Chen explained. The woman had no limits to her bigotry. David looked around at his neighbors, the Johnsons with their perfectly positioned mailbox, the Patels with their beautiful flower garden, Mrs. Chen with her thriving vegetable plot. This was what a real community looked like. "You know what? The best part is," David said to the group, "Emma's birthday party ain't ruined after all. It just took a few months to finish properly." Officer Thompson grinned. "Speaking of which, I heard there might be cake involved in this conversation." Maria laughed. "There's always cake in this house. Emma insists on celebrating something every week." As they all headed toward the patio where Maria had indeed prepared an impromptu celebration, David reflected on the past few months. Sometimes standing up to bullies meant getting tased on your front lawn. Sometimes it meant letting them dig their own graves before revealing your hand. But it always meant protecting the people you loved and the community you believed in. Emmer tugged on his shirt. "Daddy, what would you have done if the bad lady had tried to take our house away?" David knelt down to her level, looking directly into her curious eyes. "The same thing we did, sweetheart. We would have told the truth, gathered our evidence, and trusted that good people would listen. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, but it's always worth it in the end." Officer Thompson raised his coffee mug in a toast to the Martinez family for reminding us all that standing up to corruption isn't just about legal documents and investigations. It's about protecting the kind of community where little girls can have birthday parties without fear. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, David realized that Karen had been right about one thing. This incident had changed everything about their community. But instead of making them uncomfortable, it had brought them all closer together. Sometimes the best defense against injustice is simply refusing to be intimidated by it. What would you have done in David's position? Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with anger, but with patience, preparation, and the unshakable belief that truth will always win in the end. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Headaches Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.